Welcome back to our Geneva Roundtable Symposium. My name is Brian Bethune. I'm Professor of Practice at Boston College, and I'm very pleased to provide a short introduction to today's panels and discussions, but also give you a very succinct synopsis of what went on on day one, which was yesterday, and of course, there were a lot of important events in Geneva yesterday, and the symposium, of course, was number one. And the second most important was the summit between Putin and Biden. So let me just do a quick share screen here. Share my screen. And I have to, in my case, I have to select the right screen. Okay, so here's the day one synopsis. And on day one, we had panel one. Panel one was looking at mapping the recovery from the 2020 pandemic shock. We all know what that is, needs no introduction. And prospects for escaping the global liquidity trap. We went through a brief recap of the pandemic recovery. We highlighted a V-shaped recovery in China, in the US, and a super V recovery in China. Those recoveries were facilitated by strong fiscal and monetary stimulus in both countries. China's recovery was powered up by exports. A lot of those exports went to the European Union. What's the result? A very short 4-month recession in the US and no recession in China. Emerging and developing markets, particularly in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa, are behind the recovery curve. What are the major issues for the next phase? Well, we've seen this massive injection of liquidity by the Fed. Liquidity was poured into the system, as you know, by Bagehot's dictum. The Fed definitely doubled down on Bagehot's dictum. A lot of liquidity, but of course, there was both demand for liquidity and supply of liquidity. So there's some sense there was some remarkable equilibrium there. How will the next phase of this recovery play out in terms of pent-up spending? Quite a bit of discussion on that. And then, of course, now the big issue is the recovery in US and China and manufacturing in the Eurozone has led to supply chain constraints and stronger than expected upward pressure on prices, particularly fuel, used and new cars, airfares, and car rentals. So that is a situation that's now become problematic. So questions considered: how will the Federal Reserve walk the tightrope, sustaining the recovery and maintaining credibility on the inflation target? Our panel yesterday concluded that the Fed is likely to raise interest rates at the end of 2022. Well, later on that day, the Federal Reserve FOMC confirmed that it's very likely that they're going to raise interest rates somewhere near the end of 2022 and possibly raise them twice in 2023. So then the question that remains is, what are the potential implications of the Fed raising interest rates to the delayed recovery in the emerging markets? I can think of quite an interesting topic coming up here for Symposium 2022. All right, so let's move on to the next, which was international law. Very briefly, first one was confronting the potential threats of new nationalism. Importantly, Bartram Brown indicated that nationalism is not new, but with the increasing interdependence among states and obvious pandemic shock, raises the risk of disruptive nationalism. Nationalism may disrupt international cooperation. We've seen this with the pandemic shock. So he contrasted the positives of civic nationalism, which is inclusive, and ethnic nationalism, which is exclusionary. Couple of quotes here. Contrasting Trump, I'm a nationalist, versus Macron. Patriotism is the opposite of nationalism. And then Trump's critique of globalism and undermining of the WTO, NATO, WHO, and ICJ. We all know about that. There is, of course, the problem that in the US, there's the idea that there's freedom of speech, and it's very kind of what you might call, there's a lot of lanes in that highway, freedom of speech. And the US tolerates more speech than typically what we find elsewhere. So then that's already one part of US exceptionalism. And then the other one is the one where is the political exceptionalism. And there's a quote that Professor Brown mentioned from Madeleine Albright. If we have to use force, it's because we are America. We are the indispensable nation. There we go. And conclusions from Professor Brown: nationalism is here to stay, but with increasing interdependence, we need to find a way to smooth out the rough edges. That's a brilliant conclusion as far as I'm concerned. The other panel was dealing with the climate change and law of the sea. This is Professor Charles Norkey. And Professor Norkey introduced this important frame of reference: two poles, Antarctica and the Arctic, but there's distinct impacts. The Arctic is an ocean surrounded by land, while the Antarctica is a landmass surrounded by ocean. So importantly, then, he focused on the Arctic Ocean, which is the fourth largest ocean with 8 littoral states. And there's, he referenced the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea in 1982, and Professor Kaflish being involved with the negotiation of that important treaty. The Arctic has lost 650,000 square miles of ice. And while the UN treaty specifies 200-mile economic exclusion zone, guess what? There's another 150 miles that are up for grabs, claims based on scientific evidence. The Arctic zone is complex. It's much more than an ocean and ice. There's commercial and tourism, shipping, fisheries, natural resources, indigenous peoples, and thus climate change is a multidimensional impact. There is the Arctic Council, intergovernmental organization, that is in Tromsø, Norway, permanent participants, observing groups, and indigenous groups. It governs search and rescue responsibilities and scientific cooperation. And here we go as a theme again. China maintains a strong interest in the Arctic and has a large fleet of icebreakers. Greenland is moving towards independence from Denmark, and that would have an impact on the NATO presence there. So that's the summary. And what I'd like to do now is move on to today's panels, and I'd like to introduce Professor Richard Baldwin, Professor of International Economics at the Graduate Institute, Geneva, founder and editor-in-chief of the policy portal voxeu.org. He regularly advises governments and international organizations on globalization and trade policy issues. Many of you have read or been assigned his book in international trade and finance. In 1991, he served as the senior staff economist for President George Bush Council of Economic Advisors, having completed his PhD in economics at MIT with Paul Krugman. We all love Paul Krugman, of course, and perhaps he also loves himself, but that's another topic. Professor Baldwin's latest book, Globotics Upheaval, Globalization, Robotics, and the Future of Work, published in February 2019. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Baldwin.
Thank you very much, Brian.
I'll see if I can.
You're gonna, maybe Clementine can take down your screen too.
Yes, that would be helpful because, yeah. Oh, here we go. I got it finally. Yeah.
There we go. Perfect.
There we
Perfect.
go. All right.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Brian, and also thank you for the summary. Sounded like I didn't actually have time to attend, but it sounded like a fascinating discussion. But today we have another set of fascinating discussions and fascinating panelists. I'm moderating the first panel, which is the challenges of digitalization and data flows to international trade. And we have two impressive, excellent, insightful panelists. The first one is Sherry Stephenson, a well-known trade scholar who's focused on different things over the years. I first met her when she was doing regulation, then services, and now digital stuff as following the most important trends. The second speaker will be Parita Sorsa, also a well-known trade scholar who was active at the OECD for a long time, and before that at the IMF and the World Bank. So each of the speakers has 20 minutes, and they both have PowerPoint presentations to go through. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sherry first. But I'd just like to let you know that we will have time for Q&A. So please put questions in the Q&A, and I'll gather them together and get through as many as I can at the end. Sherry, the floor is yours. Oops, you're on mute, Sherry.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Richard, for the introduction. I am very delighted to be a part of this inaugural session of the Graduate Institute Geneva Roundtable Symposium, an excellent initiative. Congratulations to the organizers for making it happen. Before I launch into my presentation, I just want to say that I have always been very proud to carry forward the Graduate Institute's values of international cooperation, peaceful coexistence and mutual respect, and its interdisciplinary approach to learning and problem solving throughout my professional career. And I wanted to acknowledge that. So now I will find my PowerPoint presentation and put it up. The topic I've chosen to speak on today, as Richard said, is digitalization and data flows and the challenges that they pose to international trade.
Do you want Clementine to pull it up for you, because we don't see your slides?
It should have just appeared.
No, we don't see anything.
Really?
Now I got it at least, yeah.
It should have appeared. It is a bit slow on this WebEx, but it should have appeared. How about now, Richard?
No, but keep going if other people can see it.
Brian, can you see it?
I can see it. Yeah.
I can see it as well, and the attendees can see it as well.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you. The thesis of my presentation is that digitalization is both the biggest opportunity, but also the biggest challenge that has arisen for international trade since our multilateral trading system was established as part of the Bretton Woods system of economic governance in 1948, nearly 75 years ago. And we're going to delve into why I think this is the case. But before we get there, I think a bit of introductory concepts. What is actually digital trade? Digital trade, you can think of most simply as any digitally enabled transaction of cross-border exchange of goods or services. But it contains many different components that you might not think of immediately when we say that. So I just want to run through them quickly. And this little diagram on the left gives you an illustration of these different components. And they include cloud services, which we all use, 3D printing, which many firms are starting to use, which often is located in a foreign market, foreign location, online platforms that firms use to raise funding from investors, electronic transmissions of designs and products, electronic payment services, alerts and tracking for shipments that are online, advertising services that are placed on social media platforms, and of course, the actual sale of products and services on online platforms, as well as the reviews and advertising that is solicited afterwards. So I just want to say that all of these digital meat components increase the scale, scope, and speed of international trade, which is, and it also increases the accessibility of international trade for small and medium-sized firms and even individual entrepreneurs. So it makes global markets much more accessible. How much of trade is already digital? More than you might think. Digital trade has grown tremendously over the past 20 years and continues to do so. It's estimated that presently over 50% of services trade is conducted in digital form and around 15% of goods trade. But keep in mind that although less physical products are traded electronically, nonetheless, the components or what is behind the trade in physical goods are often digitized services. So you might ask yourself these questions. How much do you shop online? How many of the inputs and the online purchases you make might come from abroad? You probably don't even know or have an idea. And how many of these might be delivered in digital form? So these are the questions that lie behind digital trade. But what enables digital trade? This is, again, something that people often don't realize, and that is that digital trade is enabled by data flows. They are sort of the fluid that allows the rest to happen. The increased use of the internet, e-commerce, and digital platforms have gone hand in hand with increased underlying data flows. And now more than 2/3 of global trade depends absolutely on access to cross-border data flows. So without cross-border data flows, we would not have digital trade. These cross-border data flows grew by 45 times over just a decade. 2005 to 2015, and the McKinsey Global Institute has estimated that they raised global GDP 10% more or over what it would have been without cross-border data flows, which is tremendous when you think about it. It is actually data flows that have kept our economies afloat during COVID because they have enabled the operation of digital platforms for communications and transport networks, cloud computing, telehealth, telework, and social media. And these have connected firms and consumers, patients, students, and families worldwide. But a note of sobriety here, this has only been possible for those who are actually connected, which we'll discuss a little more later. The challenges that digitalization poses for international trade, I would like to cover 4 of these. I'm sure there are more, but I'm going to focus on 4. And then I'm going to address 2 challenges which digital trade fit in with the broader economy and other digital concerns. So the first challenge I'd like to speak to is we don't really have an agreement on what defines digital trade. In particular, what is the scope of digital trade? What does it cover? The burning question is, does it or does it not include data flows? Originally, trade officials focused on e-commerce, just the electronically enabled sale of goods and services cross-border. But now this is seen by many as too narrow. The recent understanding by many trade officials expands the concept of digital trade to cover data flows as well. But even here, we have questions. Some trade economists view data flows as a mode of delivery for services, but others view them as a separate entity altogether. Other economists view data flows as different from other forms of trade for various reasons, including the difficulty of determining origin and destination of these data flows because data live in the cloud, and the cloud doesn't have any geographical boundaries. However, our trade rules are premised on the existence of national boundaries and cross-border trade across these national boundaries. So data doesn't this definition. But digital trade would not exist without data flows. Challenge 2, our trade rules have gaps in the digital area. the WTO came into force in a pre-digital world, 1995, when less than 2% of the population had access to the internet and data flows were practically non-existent. So clearly, given the growth of digital trade, multilateral trade rules, or digitally enabled trade, need to be updated to take into account the digital economy. The WTO is in the process of a plurilateral negotiation on e-commerce, which has not yet concluded. It's ongoing. Some recent free trade agreements, regional agreements, have incorporated disciplines on digital trade. This is a work in progress. The current WTO rules, it's important to underline, are what we call technology neutral. That is, they do not care in what form trade takes place. They cover all forms of trade, whether it be through digitally delivered means or actual physical means. So the rules that we have in place do cover electronically enabled transactions or digitally enabled transactions, but nonetheless, there are big gaps that remain. There are many aspects relevant to digital trade which are not covered. And the new types of barriers which governments are putting in place that affect data flows are also not disciplined. And this leads to the third big challenge, which is that of rising digital protectionism. Increasingly, governments are adopting and putting in place measures that affect data and digital trade. These include, first and foremost, what we call data localization requirements, which is the obligation to store data or to locate computing facilities or servers locally, that is within a national jurisdiction, which cuts the data off from being used in the rest of the cloud. Governments also impose various forms of bans or restrictions on cross-border data flows. Technology barriers often are required as well for firms, which oblige them to meet security standards and disclose encryption algorithms or source codes for the technology they're using for these digital transactions. And there are various barriers to the actual use of the internet in the form of issues like authentication of electronic signatures and the authorization for use of electronic payments. So some of these issues are being dealt with in the ongoing plurilateral negotiations under the WTO. Some of these issues have been dealt with in free trade agreements, but not all of them have been dealt with everywhere. These new barriers pose a major threat to the growth of digital trade, the use of the internet, and of course, economic development. This graph gives you some idea of the rather exponential growth in the application of data restrictions or regulations after the year 2000, when they really took off. These data regulations that governments have been adopting include measures that affect data transfers and local data storage requirements that I mentioned. It's notable that over 3/4 of these measures, 79%, which were taken just between over the 5 years, 2014 to the end of 2018, were actually restrictive measures or tightening. And only around 1/5 of these, or 20%, were liberalizing. So most of this cumulative number of data regulations you see here are actually restrictive measures. These are not yet disciplined at the WTO level. This leads to the fourth challenge, which is we are also in front of a very divergent data governance frameworks. So to address this, let's look at what is data governance. You can define data governance as the process of managing the availability, usability, integrity, and security of all types of data in the economy. One of the most challenging aspects of data governance for trade is the divergent approaches that we have in the world economy to treatment of cross-border flows for personal data. So this is a big challenge. Not all governments see this alike. It's very contextual. And so how do trade agreements deal with data protection, the different data protection laws that cover personal data flows, noting that the WTO has no rules in this area, and that this is a very controversial issue in the e-commerce negotiations. So recent trade agreements, the free trade agreements that have developed rules for digital trade, only require the enforcement of domestic privacy laws, but they do not provide any mechanism for ensuring the interoperability of these laws to allow for cross-border data flows. So governments need to enforce their own laws, but they don't need to make these laws compatible with the data regime of other trading partners, which means that basically we have a huge stumbling block in international trade with respect to the compatibility or incompatibility of data privacy and data regimes. You can basically think of these as three different types of models or approaches, broadly speaking, that exist in the world economy. This open transfer model, which is basically liberal, all data can flow. There are privacy laws in place, but they rely on ex post enforcement of any violations to data privacy. So this is more or less the US model. A conditional transfer model, which has strong rights for the protection of personal data, and with data transfers conditional on meeting these requirements. This is the EU model under the GDPR. And thirdly, the limited transfer model, which has extensive restrictions on data flows with mandatory storage and processing of data at home, which is followed by China and Russia, amongst others. So the big question is, where is the best place to negotiate interoperability of data regimes? Trade agreements don't attempt to do this, as I said, but trade outcomes are very much affected by decisions about this. So are we making progress meeting these challenges? I would say that the area of digital transformation and digital trade and digital governance, data governance is the most dynamic area of research right now in the international trade sphere. There's considerable focus and experimentation on digital issues and on digital trade on several different fronts. And it's ongoing. At the WTO, as I mentioned, we had the plurilateral e-commerce negotiations. At the regional level, we have several FTAs that have recently developed pretty sophisticated rules on digital trade. These include the CPTPP and the USMCA as some of the best examples. We also have last year, for the first time, the actual development of standalone digital agreements, which were negotiated by countries primarily in Asia, the DIPA, which is the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, and the DEA, which is the Digital Economy Agreement between Singapore and Australia. And these were both concluded in 2020, and they may mark a shift in the way we look at digital issues, not within free trade agreements, but as standalone agreements. There's some discussion of negotiating a digital agreement between the US and the EU, for example. At the more political level, the G20 and the G7, there are initiatives that are undertaken to examine how to operationalize the principle of data free flow with trust that the G20 members agreed upon in 2019. And then at the level of regional organizations, APEC and the OECD, these have developed principles, they're obviously non-binding, for data privacy and for cross-border data flows, which countries are free to draw upon as they negotiate more binding trade agreements. So lots of activity going on, very much a work in progress, which leads me to the broader challenges. International trade is only one of many digital concerns in the world economy. There are many, all of our lives now basically are digital. And this means it affects many different areas of economic and security and social policy. So trade has to be put in the context of these different broader concerns. One is digital taxation. Digital taxation issues are being considered by national authorities, but also being negotiated within the OECD. You may have heard of the imposition of digital services taxes, which is highly controversial. The area of competition policy. Trade agreements often encourage regulatory cooperation on competition policy, but have not set very many competition rules. So competition policy, in terms of rules to discipline the competitive practices of large technology companies, we all know them, these are generally undertaken at the level of national authorities. The EU has been very active here. Digital standards. The development of digital standards is an important area, which might allow us to move to more harmonized view on some of these digital issues. This is being undertaken by national bodies. We have two international organizations that look at this as well, the ISO and the IEC. And then the growing areas of cybercrime and cybersecurity, which have become so prominent these days with the increase in cybercrimes committed. National law enforcement bodies examine this, often with cooperation behind the scenes of others. And disinformation, which is now propagated on social media and has been seen to influence election outcomes. So this is a huge problem, which trade agreements don't deal with and national authorities are looking at. All of these areas are not just national concerns, however. They all affect, they all have cross-border implications. And so they all require international cooperation, but most of these areas have no international body to carry their work forward. So trade is unique in this context. It does have an international body to look at this. So this chart just attempts to set out the interface between trade and other areas of digital concern, and to make the points that digital trade and data governance are impacted by several other economic and security areas. And that likewise, on their side, trade rules will have an impact on the achievement of these other regulatory goals. So this creates a situation of mutual interface and coexistence, but it also argues for an overall framework, which we don't have in place right now, either at the national or the international level. And perhaps the creation of a body that is calling out to be created, such as a new global data forum, which would bring all of these different areas of digital concern together. I'll leave this, maybe we can discuss this later on. And then my last challenge, again, in the broader world economic context, is that of growing digital inequality. In 2016, the UN General Assembly passed a non-binding resolution that declared internet access a human right. In my view, connectivity and data access are both indispensable to achieve all 17 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But right now, 40% of the world's population is not online. And what might even be more surprising is that of the 4.6 billion internet users, which is a lot, that would be 60% of the world, 93% of these access the internet via mobile devices, not via computers. And this is not nearly as enabling as the use of computers. So we have a very long ways to go. And digital trade in this context can either be a force for economic and social integration, or it can further deepen existing inequality in internet access and use. And it depends upon a number of factors that go beyond trade, but trade is one of them. It can either bring our global world together, or it can deepen these digital divides. So in conclusion, I'd like to make just 4 concluding thoughts. One is that digitalization poses very different types of challenges to international trade than traditional trade in goods and services that we know. And this is primarily because of associated data flows. Secondly, the updated rules for digital trade are critical for the trading system, but they will need to be complemented by discussions elsewhere. For example, on the interoperability of data privacy regimes for cross-border data flows. Thirdly, trade is only one part of the digital picture. Many digital challenges fall outside of the trade arena, as we just saw, but they can have an impact on it and vice versa. And lastly, digital trade can be a force for integration and development, or it can deepen economic and social inequality. So these are my thoughts, and thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Sherry. So if Clementine, if you could just take down Sherry's, there we go. Okay, we'll pass the floor directly to Parita. So Parita, if you can start sharing your screen and there we go, perfect.
Well, so far it was in the end, but okay, so here we go to start. So I chose my topic as an emerging issue in trade, the sort of a pressure to favor local production. It's no new issue in world trade or production, but it's raising its head and can be a new challenge for the recovery. So try to get to my next slide. Okay, then what is the issue then? So we've seen that after the 2008 crisis and now the pandemic, there's been increased populism and a backlash against globalization, and calls to nationalism, as was discussed yesterday a bit by Bart Brown in the legal context. And there's also pressure for protectionism to favor local production or consumption. So this one can see in many places. And around 2016, there were many trade economists writing articles about the pros and cons, mostly cons of local production requirements. But lately, even Paul Krugman and Martin Wolf have raised this issue in their articles in the FT and the New York Times as a thing to worry about. Now here is just an example how widespread this sentiment against globalization is, because these are two examples from the small village where I'm in France. You have big signs around the village saying that buy local, it's vital. And also I noticed in a newspaper, there was an ad by a local supermarket saying that please help us help French fishermen. So please buy only French fish. So this buying local is really getting to all kinds of corners. And another issue that's been discussed lately a lot is the large share of trade in global value chains, because it's exposing many countries to dependence on a few suppliers when there are shocks. So we've seen that most recently in disruptions in semiconductor chip supply or vaccine nationalism during COVID, and this has raised talk about calling for reshoring the value chains to enhance stability and resilience of the supply chains. Then policymakers are responding to these calls, to these populist calls. In the US, President Biden in his website is calling for commitment to buy American and making this promise real, not just rhetoric like may have been by his predecessor. But he has promised to tighten domestic content rules for public procurement. Also recently there was a report, Harris-Biden on supply chains, to see what to do with these risks depending on global value chains. In France also, President Macron last year made statements that we need to humanize capitalism, and this means that one has to have more economic sovereignty by investing at home in industrial sectors such as electric vehicle batteries and now medical equipment, and it can mean many other things too. Basically, industrial policy producing more locally. And these local production rules, even before these two crises, have been quite widely used in emerging markets. So what is then the evidence that these rules are becoming more binding or more protectionist? It's very difficult to find recent data on this because like OECD, UNCTAD, WTO or World Bank, they collect data on trade measures, but they don't tend to be very up to date. They tend to have a lag of a few years. The best source I found for this is the Global Trade Alert. And they have, I think every 6 months, they publish data on new trade interventions in the world trade. Now, this is not just the local content requirements, but it's also all kinds of other measures that are there to restrict trade. And you can see from the chart that the red one, which is the harmful interventions, is really rising very rapidly since 2009, and especially in the past few years. And then on the right, you have some of the policy instruments used in these measures. Now, linked to what Sherry was saying is then I just pulled the data for services. And of course, there are less measures in services because there's less trade in services than in goods. But what's quite striking is the sharp rise in the curve of the measures introduced in the past few years. So in a way, the data will prove then that this is becoming also, of course, these are number of measures. They don't measure how much trade is affected, but it's a sort of a proxy to show that it is a concern. Now, here's just an example of some products that are most affected since 2009, and they tend to be a lot related to steel and chemicals and metals, pharmaceuticals and motor vehicles. And one estimate I found that these measures tend to cover about 40% of world trade. So then more in detail, what are these local production requirements? Often they mean that there are rules that one has to buy a certain percentage of inputs locally, and then often there's an import tariff to protect these local purchases. For example, a car manufacturer must buy 40% of inputs from local manufacturers. Now then there's a close link to investment rules. Often investment is conditional on local purchase of inputs. These are quite often used in India or Brazil or Argentina. And a lot of these measures are in public procurement. I already mentioned Mr. Biden's pledge in the beginning, and they tend to be linked to on public procurement, yeah, and the mining projects, audiovisual, and so on. And the data sources have been reporting these for decades, and now these measures are spreading to these new areas like e-commerce, like Sherry was saying, data storage, or there's more and more of them used in environmental products or pressures to use them for environmental purposes. So most economists broadly agree that these rules are bad. They are bad for the economy. And there's some long literatures looking at their impact depending on market structure, openness, size of the economy, industry structure, and so on, starting from the 80s already. A lot of famous trade economists have been writing about this. Now, they all tend to agree that these local content requirements, they raise production cost and prices, decrease trade in intermediate goods, lower competitiveness and innovation, and hurt jobs across the economy. One good example from Argentina is that they had a requirement for mobile phones and computers to be assembled in Tierra del Fuego, which is all the way in the southern tip of Argentina. And it cost huge amounts to produce them. So the local cost of these cell phones or computers was very, very high for many years. And then, of course, it had a big impact on the economy, because if people can't afford to buy computers or cell phones, it has an impact on the spread of technologies and productivity and so on. So these have been lifted since, but for many years, this was a local value-added requirement in Argentina. OECD has one recent study where they show that how trade in final goods decreased quite a lot, and also unskilled job disappeared many times, the skilled ones. And there are many other studies there showing how costly these measures are. So why are they used then so often? Now it's about politics. They sound politically attractive. In the short run, they can create jobs visibly, and often industry and union lobbying are lobbying together for more jobs with these local production requirements. There are no fiscal costs, This can be an attraction now that fiscal deficits are very high and debt. So if governments want to have local production as a way to get out of the crisis, they can do this without much fiscal cost. And for many, it sounds good, produce locally, create local jobs without considering the potential costs. And most of these economic costs in higher prices and so on, they are mostly felt over the longer run. So then I asked myself a question, okay, these are used so much, aren't they forbidden by these trade rules? And then when one takes a closer look at WTO rules, they are not very clear or they have many holes. And the basic principle of GATT was that national treatment should apply to all taxes and regulations to imports and local production. And then there's TRIMS, trade-related investment measures from the Uruguay round. It tends to cover only goods trade. So services are outside these disciplines of the trade-related investment measures. Then government procurement, there's a special agreement on that for only those countries that have signed it. And the way it tends to function is that only certain open sector lists are included, which excludes many public procurement activities, which explains why they are so widely used in these local content requirements in public procurement. Now, subsidies, there are definitional problems, and then dispute settlement. It's open to countries, not companies, and it can be very costly and complicated to use the WTO dispute settlement procedure for these local content requirements. Nevertheless, there have been some famous cases of cars in Indonesia and so on. The countries have taken this up in the dispute settlement. So then, finally, what to do? There are many suggestions in the literature. If one listens to trade economists, they often go for the first best, which means that don't use them. But in real life, this may be quite unrealistic because as the use of these local content or production requirements is quite widespread. Now, first thing that comes to mind that if one could highlight the domestic costs better of these local content requirements, how much they raise prices or how much employment might be lost. This Argentina example is a good one on these cell phones or computers, that what can happen when these measures really raise costs. Now, emphasize other policies. This is often recommended by the OECD, at least, that one should look more horizontal, industrial or other policies, avoid picking winners. OECD also often talks about strengthening institutions. And lately there have been calls for this global value chain reshoring, that one should use some kind of a risk assessment measures with these value chains, that if you depend on one product in China or Vietnam, you should find some kind of a measure to assess the risk or sensitivity of certain events of these dependence on these sources. Now, one way to deal with this also is to improve these measures as such. One can link them to innovation or learning. Very often they have no sunset clauses, which means that they can exist forever. But if one puts sunset clauses to these, the time limits for these measures, that can help a bit enhance efficiency and reduce dependence on these. Then increase transparency again of cost and other things that happen with these requirements. Now, one option is then to negotiate a new code in the WTO, which some of the trade economists were proposing around 2015-16. But as we all know from the experience, negotiating anything at the WTO can take a very, very long time. So this code would not help us get out of the current recession or downturn and help the recovery. So a pragmatic way out might be to act on all these fronts, try to see case by case in different countries what might be the best policies to be done. So I guess our job as economists would be to bring out the issue and highlight the costs and try to win the political support of those that may listen. Okay, thank you.
There we go. Thank you very much, Parita. If you could stop sharing your screen so we'll all get back on the screen. So I have a few questions in the chat. But what I wanted to do first was to prompt Sherry to talk a little bit more about the international political differences in positions on data and digitization. There's a little bit of a north-south schism and also a little bit of sort of G7 versus China schism. Would that be something that you'd like to expand on? Because I mean, you laid out the problems, but not the politics of it, not the international politics, which is so important in trade policy. Or have I put you on the spot?
You have a little bit put me on the spot because it's obviously a very politically sensitive issue, which is tied to political regimes and not just economic regimes. And so that's why this is a very thorny issue in international trade, because it goes beyond trade. It goes to the way that governments choose to interact with their citizens and the type of control that they feel they need to maintain over not just citizen behavior, but national security. And so it is something that is manifested. It's not really so much actually, Richard, the north-south divide. I would disagree with that part. It is actually, it's not characterized by that because Russia has a very controlled data governance system as well. It's not just China. It's very much Russia. If you really wanted to put it down into classifications, you would put it down into more authoritarian states versus more liberal, opening, more open democratic states. You would put it that way. And yet, even if you put it that way, there's a big difference between the US and the EU. Because in the EU, the European Commission has adopted personal data protection as a human right. So they have placed the protection of personal data at the level of all of the other UN human rights. That hasn't been the case. That hasn't been done in other developed economies, for example. So that is one of the fundamental reasons why the GDPR regime for data protection in the EU is so different from how it takes place in other market economies like the US or Australia or New Zealand or so forth. And Japan is kind of a hybrid. So I don't want to, it really is a question of the relationship of the state to its citizens and a question of values and a question of, the degree of market capitalism that is in place and what you're willing to trade off in this context. But I would say that many developing countries, and many of them do not yet have data governance laws, and this is a big issue in the world economy. About half of the countries in Africa do not yet have in place a data governance framework law. So, and they're in process of being developed, but the new ones that are adopted or have been adopted recently tend to follow more the EU model. So I don't see this being a north-south issue. Now, the real question is the EU model too restrictive in the long run to permit the kind of things we want data flows to do in the world economy? What do we want data flows to do? We want them to underpin efficient economic activity. We want them to allow for, innovation. And recently, there have been several complaints, not only by firms outside the EU, but by firms inside the EU, that the GDPR is actually too restrictive and doesn't allow these objectives to be met. So there's a rethink right now of the scope and the way the GDPR is being carried out. So it's a very much a fluid situation where I would say that there's experimentation going on, trial and error. We don't really know yet where we're going to come in terms of the trade-off between economic efficiency, innovation, and personal data protection. But so far, the US errs on one side, the EU on the other, but it's not necessarily a north-south issue, no. It's more of a political regime, economic governance issue. And so that's one thing, but could I take this opportunity to answer one of the questions that is in the Q&A on data, or do you want to carry on? Okay.
Let me just bring in Parita first.
Sure.
So Pravita, I asked Sherry an international politics question. I'd like to ask you a domestic policy question. What's driving this buy local thing? What is the politics? What's driving this new push towards buying local, in your view? Or even taking the local village that you're in. Why are they all of a sudden interested in buying local?
Well, it seems to be sort of a fashion, and it's partly influenced by environmental discussions, because people think, transporting some products for 6 hours by lorry versus buying them locally, in a way you would avoid environmental costs. So this is one part of it. But of course, whether you're willing to pay for this environmental element of these things depends often on your incomes. But it's this overall backlash against globalization and all that. I think the globalization is seen in many places as bringing negative job losses and so on. And these politicians are now joining this bandwagon and buy local. Now, it's fine if a consumer wants to buy local and pay higher price, so then you should not have an issue with that. But when you start putting restrictions on trade and others, then it gets a bit trickier.
Thank you very much. Now, I think that's very much true, that there's this idea that local is better and international is causing scary things. And I don't know if the COVID made it worse or better, but it opened our eyes to how international we are. But I think it also made people a little bit more fearful. So let me go back to Sherry. And I was thinking if you could take the question of Kyle de Klerk, which is, do you think it's worthwhile putting the data flows into these pre-existing regulatory categories that we have at the WTO, or that they need an entirely new category itself?
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Richard. That's a good question. And, data is something hard to think about because it kind of eludes these specific categorization because it is very fluid, and data that might be a component in the production of a good at one point moves immediately to a service in another. So it's really hard, Kyle, to categorize data flows by these types of categories: goods, services, investment, labor. Almost impossible. The way that people working on data governance issues have proposed to categorize data is a little bit different. It's by the type of data that are generated, whether they're generated in the production of goods or services or investment, it doesn't matter where. It's the type of data. Let me give you a bit of an example. There's no agreement, but these are the ideas that are germinating and floating around the world economy amongst the data experts. There is a suggestion that data should be divided into 3 or 4 different kinds of categories. One category, commercial data. So they call it F data. I don't like that, but firm data, which would be generated and owned by firms. And these data would be shared if the firms wanted them to be, which they often do. Then a category of O data, which is official data, which are generated or created by the state, such as birth certificates and driver's license and things like that, and which would not be shared. And then there's P data, which would be private personal data created by people or about people on the basis of people's behavior, what they share online, what they post, their videos, what you put on Facebook or Twitter and so forth, or what you click in terms of what you sell. And this personal data is the most complicated category, obviously, because do you share this? Does this data allow to be flowed? It depends. The answer is maybe. And the proposals are to give the people who generate this data, this P data, personal data, what they call the ability to make decisions over the use of this data. So they would be the enablers of the use of the data. And you could decide to either not make it available, or you could decide to make it available if compensated. But for this, one would require all kinds of different schemes to be put in place that would allow this to be operational or actually to happen, such as data trusts or data entities, which would be the gatekeepers for the P data. So I could go on, but this is not the purpose. I think just to give you a flavor, Kent, of the kind of complexity of this issue, but the categories of data would be based on more who generates it. Thanks. I hope I didn't freeze during that.
No, your face, at least for me, the face is freezing, but the voice was perfect. So,
Okay,
but I think even within that P category, there's important differences between medical data and financial data, and
yes,
details of where you live and what you do, that sort of stuff.
yes,
and then other things that like
yes,
what you buy online and things like that. So I think that is important. But you'd mentioned that one solution would be this kind of global data forum as a way of kind of talking about it all at the same place, and therefore maybe not creating a new category, but dealing with it in a place that's more adapted to it. So let me ask Parita a question about local content restrictions. Now, those have been useful in some development exercises, probably fewer than people hope for, but there have been examples like the Thai auto industry where it helped them grab more of the value chain. And certainly in things like digital, China's closing to digital to start with allowed their big internet giants to get started. So would you say that there's a kind of some criteria we should look at for when they shouldn't be allowed? Let's say if we extend them to services, or you just think they're basically overall a bad idea?
Well, one of the points I made in the end that you can improve these local content requirements, and I think the literature also shows that they can be more successful in larger economies. Maybe that's why in China or Thailand, and it depends a bit how they are designed. If they have sunset clauses, if they are linked to some conditions of technology and gradually exposing them to competition or issues like that. So I guess in theory they could work, but there are just so many bad examples around.
Sure.
So maybe for politicians, if they are done, so one should emphasize these criteria where they can be successful.
Absolutely. So I think just to tie it in with what Sherry was talking about, I think a lot of the data localization and the restrictions are countries like India hoping that they can develop their own e-commerce giants and platforms and social media platforms. And so that this idea that import substitution trade policy but applied to digital may still be useful. I think that's one of the big issues that keeping people from going forward. I had an interesting discussion with the Indian ambassador last year, where he explained basically we don't know enough about data to set the rules down, that we don't know what it's useful for, what are the dynamics of it, what is the role of the economy. And so he was arguing that we just shouldn't make any rules in the WTO at all because we don't know enough. So I don't know. What do you think about that, Sherry? You agree with that?
Richard, you keep asking me all the difficult questions. But
that's what you get paid the big money for, huh?
I think that is an interesting thought, but I would not share it. I think that we do need disciplines on aspects of digital trade so that it can promote the interests of small and lesser developed economies, and particularly firms from those economies, help them to get authentication for electronic signatures, for electronic payments, to protect their firms from exposing their algorithms and source codes. And I think that the thorny issues deserve to be discussed somewhere, if not in the WTO, where, because these are issues that impact on trade. And if 50% of our services are already traded in digital form, and much of our goods, and we're moving in that direction. How can we ignore this? I think that, you know, ignoring it would be putting our head in the sand and allowing restrictions on data flows and on digital trade to continue to grow, which clearly would not be the ideal solution and would have an even more dampening impact on innovation, efficiency, and trade benefits, which always impacts the smallest countries the most, and the least developed the most. Sure.
So, Parita, there's a question here for you about the connection between local content restrictions and climate change, mitigating climate change. So the premise is that mitigation of climate change could involve relocation to domestic sources of agriculture, and that local content restrictions could encourage this, even though if that's not their original intent. What is your comment on that? Do you think that's a twist that you didn't touch about, climate change and local content restrictions trying to reduce trade to save the environment?
Yeah, it's a tricky question. It's a bit linked to these CO2 tariffs that are being discussed now in the EU and elsewhere. That, of course, if you start putting tariffs based on CO2 content on agricultural products, by definition, there might be increased local production. But already in many countries, this local production is already subsidized. So one has to see, maybe there's a balance to be found there, or it's hard to say. But even in the environmental equipment, they are, in many countries, they are starting to put local content requirements to them. And it depends, how you then calculate the environmental cost of many goods. To me, it's been always a super tricky question because, it never ends, where you start calculating the environmental cost. But we'll see. There may be shift from this. That's for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I saw a study recently which kind of broke down the carbon linkage to production of food. And in this study, the shipping and the transportation, which is what comes to mind, is actually a very small share of the carbon emitted doing things like agriculture and other things. And that the difference between carbon emission in different countries can far outswamp the cost of moving things from one place to another. So the agriculture may use more energy in the Netherlands, for example, than if it's grown in Northern Africa, for example. Yeah. So let me then let Sherry have the last question. Kent Jones has given you a very nice question regarding the e-commerce plurilateral negotiations. I don't know if you see that, but could you pick that one up, please?
I see that. And thank you to Kent for that question. His question is, would it be possible to conclude a critical mass agreement that will bypass the consensus rules? In other words, how to get something adopted in the WTO if we're successful in that direction? Very good question, Kent. There is no definitive answer at this point, and the participants in the e-commerce negotiations, which number a little over 80 WTO members, which I need to point out are still less than half of total WTO membership. So we still do not have even a majority, much less a critical mass of countries participating in this. So it would be, challenging, to say the least, to have a consensus agreement on adopting an outcome, which was, we can look at how Protocol 4 on telecom and Protocol 5 on financial services were attached to the GATS, General Agreement on Trade and Services, but that required a consensus outcome, and then countries adopted the protocol and implemented it as they saw fit. Now, if the consensus adoption is not possible to start with, then one way out, there are two ways out. One is to make it a plurilateral outside the WTO, which would then be applied on an MFN basis. Not as satisfactory as having it inside the WTO, but since the majority of countries, since the countries participating in these negotiations constitute the majority of e-commerce and digital transactions in the world for the time being, that would nonetheless have a huge and positive impact on international trade, but it would not incorporate the rules on a definitive basis. Second possibility is that those countries participating simply adopt it and write it into column 3 of their GATT schedules as a voluntary acceptance of the outcome, lock, stock, and barrel, in which case that would be binding amongst themselves, amongst those WTO members that adopted it, which, as I said, are the largest traders and digital concerns. And they would then have access to the WTO dispute settlement if that were the case. So I hope that answers your question. But again, this is very much outstanding. And the participants in the negotiations themselves have agreed to discuss this only at the end of their talks. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Sherry. So we should be wrapping up now to allow time for the next panel. This panel was about digital and data, one of the hottest topics in international relations right now, of course. But we're going to go to one that might even be hotter, which is global health issues. So I will pass over to Suri Moon. I don't see her in my. Let me see. Is Suri here?
Yes, here I am.
Here you are. Okay. So Suri Moon is co-director of the Global Health Center at the Graduate Institute and professor of practice. She's going to moderate the next session. So I'll just hand it over to you, Suri. Floor is all yours.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Richard, and thanks to all of the previous panelists for setting the stage for us. Indeed, it's my great pleasure and honor to be chairing this last panel that is indeed focusing on global health. I'll say just a couple quick words to introduce the topic and the kind of the logical flow of the panel before I introduce our speakers. And I think that we don't need any further reminder of the fact that health is really something that touches each and every one of us, and that the effects of health crises, of course, stretch certainly far beyond the health sector. And I think this panel is not only a reflection of that in terms of the topics that we'll be covering, in terms of the educational, disciplinary, and professional backgrounds of the speakers, but also in terms of the spread of topics that we'll be addressing. And what I wanted to really emphasize is that this is not something that graduate schools in general have traditionally embraced. And I think that one of the things that the Graduate Institute itself should be quite proud of is that it is one of the first graduate schools in the world to recognize health as an issue that requires engagement from disciplines far beyond medicine, for example, or public health. And this is an area that we have built up and are continuing to build up in the years to come. And I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has just given us a shot in the arm, so to speak, to help us move forward with that objective. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers to you. And I also want to thank Professor Brian Bethune, who has been working very hard behind the scenes to help bring this panel together. We'll be hearing first from Dr. Cody Meisner, who's a professor of pediatrics at Tufts University. He's a world-renowned expert on a range of childhood diseases and immunization, and he's going to be speaking to us first about, indeed, the challenge of expanding access to vaccination worldwide. He is a regular advisor to a number of U.S. government agencies, such as the Department of Health and Human Services, the Centers for Disease Control, and the Food and Drug Administration. So we'll turn first to Dr. Meisner. Because he's not able to stay with us the full time, I'll actually pause after his presentation in case there are questions for him, and then we'll turn to the rest of our speakers, whom I'll introduce each in turn: Beth Goldberg, Cleopatra, Dubia Henry, and then Emily Ryu. So Dr. Cody Meisner, over to you, and I believe we have your slides. Clementine has your slides ready to go.
Thank you very much, Suri. I sincerely appreciate the opportunity to participate this morning. And I also respect a great deal your opening comments about the issues of global health. I also want to thank Brian for the opportunity to participate in this symposium this morning. So could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. And this is simply to state that I have no conflict of interest. And the next slide, please. this is what I would like to try and cover this morning in the next 15 to 20 minutes. The first bullet I will go through quickly. I just want to make sure we're all starting from the same point in terms of the present pandemic with the coronavirus. I then want to spend a little bit more time on the regulatory process and compare emergency use authorization with a biological license application, and so that people fully understand the process and why there's a difference. And then I'd like to talk about the global vaccine supply versus the demand. And then finally, if we have time, I want to talk a little bit about the lessons that we have learned so far from this pandemic. So Clementine, that's great. Thank you. So where this pandemic began is a fascinating question. And I don't think we fully know the answer. We know that coronaviruses naturally live in the GI tract of bats. The bat gut is the natural reservoir for all coronaviruses. And we've known about coronaviruses for decades, but they've always been relatively mild viruses or infections, and usually causing the common cold and croup. And that's why in 2012, when it was noted that SARS-CoV-1 was first identified as a coronavirus, there was a lot of skepticism because up to that point, coronaviruses had caused relatively mild disease. But we now know there are 3 very virulent strains of coronaviruses called the beta coronaviruses that cause SARS-CoV-1, MERS, and SARS-CoV-2. SARS-CoV-1 and MERS originated from the bat droppings or guano occurs in caves. When animals wander into the cave, they can become infected by these coronaviruses, and then they spread it around. And if it undergoes sufficient mutation, then it crosses the species barrier and can jump from an intermediate animal progenitor to humans. And that's clearly what happened with SARS-CoV-1. It was the civet cat, and for MERS, it was the camel. And we're not quite sure whether that's what happened with SARS-CoV-2. That would certainly be the easiest explanation. So why is that a difficult concept for everyone to accept? And I think there are several reasons. First of all, the Wuhan Institute of Virology is really the epicenter of study of coronaviruses, particularly gain of function of coronaviruses. What that means is that people deliberately make mutations in the laboratory in a carefully controlled environment and try and anticipate what sorts of mutations will occur in the future to make the virus more virulent. Well, those studies are being performed primarily in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So it was somewhat ironic that this new, particularly virulent coronavirus occurred in Wuhan. Secondly, the Chinese researchers have been unable to find a progenitor for SARS-CoV-2, unlike MERS and SARS-CoV-1. If there was an intermediary animal, where is it? The Chinese have not been able to identify that. We also know that there are mutations in SARS-CoV-2 that simply do not occur in nature. They have never been described in a coronavirus before. And so that implies there was some genetic manipulation that predisposed to this development. Well, And as you know, the Biden administration has reopened the inquiry as to where this might have come from. And that development came for several reasons. It wasn't it wasn't possible for people to find um, uh, other outbreaks of pneumonia in China during the months preceding the first case. And then finally, there were 3 laboratory workers in the Wuhan Institute who had a syndrome that was very similar to that caused by SARS-CoV-2. So a lot of circumstantial evidence has caused uncertainty, and it's very important, I think, that we determine where this virus originated if we can. Okay, next slide, please. This is what the coronavirus looks like, the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus. The only point I want to make here is that, remember, viruses can only replicate inside a cell. Unlike bacteria, they cannot replicate outside of a human cell or other types of cells. So in order for this virus to get inside a cell, there has to be an interaction between those spikes that you can see projecting up from the surface of the virus and specific receptors on human cells. And if we can block that interaction, then a person becomes immune to the virus. So the vaccines that we're all receiving and watching so carefully consist of that spike protein that you can see projecting from the surface. And the idea is to make antibodies against that protein that will then, if we encounter the virus in our nose or respiratory tract, those antibodies will prevent the interaction between the virus and the host cell, and the virus will be unable to replicate, and that will cause immunity. And indeed, these vaccines are absolutely remarkable at accomplishing that degree of immunity. Okay, next slide, please. And this, I just wanted to show this slide so people have a sense of what happens. This is from a slide, an electron micrograph from National Institutes of Health that was circulated, and it shows respiratory cells from the respiratory tract of a human in vitro. And you can see the cilia, the normal blue cilia that are present on all of our cells, and they sweep the debris out of our lungs. But you can see the red particles, and those red particles represent SARS-CoV-2. And now let me just point out that this cell culture was infected only 96 hours earlier, and this is what's happened. So you get a sense of how this virus completely takes over the cell once it causes an infection. There are just hundreds of thousands of viral particles that are made. The second interesting point here is you can see why this virus is spread so easily, because at this stage of an infection, most people don't have any symptoms whatsoever, but they are still coughing, laughing, singing, talking. And so you can imagine how they're generating just an enormous aerosol of infectious particles to anyone who's around them. And this happens before a person becomes symptomatic. And that's why, one of the major reasons why this pandemic has become so deadly in such a short period of time. Next slide, please. Just a word about variants. I know this slide is confusing, and I apologize for that, but it shows the changing distribution of the SARS-CoV-2 variants in the United States, starting back on January 30th. I think that is in the first line of the histogram. And you can see, for example, remember the Wuhan strain that began in December of 2019, presumably, is no longer circulating. that strain has been completely replaced by these variants. And the predominant strain that's circulating in the United States and in much of the world is the variant that's labeled B117. That began in the UK, and because it had advantages in infectivity and in spreading, this virus replaced the Wuhan strain. So right now, 72% of the isolates, approximately 70% of the isolates circulating in the United States are this UK strain. What's extraordinary is that the strain that was used to make the vaccine, that is the spike protein from that original Wuhan strain, is inducing immunity against a strain that's no longer circulating. The Wuhan strain is not common at all in the United States, but the extraordinary fact is that spike protein induces immunity that's protective against all of these strains. So that's the main point. There are over 200 variants of this virus that are circulating in the United States, but these 5 or 6 strains account for more than 95%. We don't know. There will be a mutation, and there will be strains that emerge that will probably replace B117. That is, they will have greater infectivity, and there will be natural selection against those mutants, and it will favor the strain that's most contagious. And hopefully the vaccines will continue to confer protection against those strains. Okay, next slide. So this, I think people are familiar with. This is how an ordinary vaccine becomes licensed by the Food and Drug Administration. It typically takes several years to go through the BLA procedure. It begins with the company talking to the CDC and the FDA about vaccines that they would like to make. They then undergo animal testing and undergo phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials. They submit that data to the BLA portfolio. They submit to the FDA. It's the Center for Biologics Evaluation in the FDA that actually evaluates it. And the FDA then decides on whether or not to license the vaccine. And remember, it's the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, that actually makes recommendations in regard to how these vaccines could be used. And then it's up to the individual state in the United States to make their own requirements for receipt of the vaccine. But the important point I want to make here is that this is an extremely costly activity. It's, at the present time, it costs between $500 million and $1 billion to bring a vaccine through development and licensure. It's an enormously expensive process, and people have to remember that it usually fails. It's probably only about 1 in 10 vaccines that are developed that actually get to the point of licensure and sales. So next slide, please. Well, when this pandemic began, we didn't have 2 or 3 years to develop a vaccine using the conventional BLA pathway. And after 9/11 in the United States, the emergency use authorization for countermeasures was passed into law. And this developed because of the recognized need to be able to facilitate making available countermeasures that could be used to diagnose or treat a life-threatening emergency. And clearly, this pandemic satisfied that threshold. And so the FDA followed the points that are listed in the second bullet that I'll let you go over. I won't take the time to do it because I know I'm getting late. But I don't think anyone would argue that this threshold was passed. And as we know, here in the United States, this pandemic is going away. It's the number of new daily cases has been reduced by 95% since the peak earlier this year. These vaccines have been truly remarkable. So next slide, please. These are the three vaccines. I'm not going to talk about them because I know we're short. I'm almost out of time. Next slide, please. Okay, so let me make this point here. Because of the enormous cost to develop these vaccines, the government, the federal government, decided they needed to de-risk the pharmaceutical companies so that they would develop these vaccines. And I think this is often misunderstood. The vaccines underwent all the same trials that they do for a BLA. The difference is that the government said to Pfizer and Moderna and AstraZeneca and Novavax and Johnson said, we will pay for the cost of developing these vaccines. So if they don't work, it's not going to fall on you alone. We will help de-risk this cost. And to do that, we will help you build plants to manufacture the vaccines even before you've completed phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials. We will take that risk so that if the vaccines don't work, it will be paid for by the taxpayer. So the number of patients enrolled in these clinical trials is no different than the number of patients enrolled in a conventional BLA. And it's the time period for development was condensed enormously because of the huge inflow of government support. But now where are we? Well, it's going to be, and I'm running out of time here, so what? Maybe we could skip forward to the next slide. And this is the concept of herd immunity. This is a CDC slide that I've used here only to show why herd immunity is so important. You can get immunity from two ways, as we all know, either from being infected or from the vaccine. The top panel simply shows the blue figures that are not immunized. The red figures bring in a disease like SARS-CoV-2, and everybody gets infected as you move on the right-hand side. In the middle panel, some of the yellow figures are immunized. The new virus is introduced, and of course, then once again, a big outbreak of disease, as indicated by the yellow figures. Then in the bottom of the three slides, you can see most of the people in the community are yellow, meaning they are immune. And when the virus is introduced in those red figures, there's very little outbreak of disease. Some of the blue figures who are not immune develop disease. But that's the concept behind herd immunity and why it is so important in terms of public health. Okay, next slide.
Dr. Meisner, if I could ask you to wrap up, I just want to make sure we can squeeze in one question at least and still get you to your next meeting on time.
Okay, why not? Thank you very much. Why don't we stop at this juncture, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Oh, just to stop here.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for laying out the scientific and medical foundations. It really provides an excellent base for the remainder of the panel. We do have one question from a participant, Kent Jones. Going back to the point with which you began your presentation, which is about the initial emergence of this virus. Are there ways to detect these kinds of outbreaks faster before they spread? And would it be feasible simply to tighten the existing international rules, the international health regulations, or do you think something else is needed? And this is a question I'd like to pose to you, and perhaps we'll also come back to it later as well.
Thank you, Suri. And it flows very nicely from your introduction, is that public health is now what we've learned. It's a global issue. If the pandemic is continuing in India or Brazil or South Africa, new mutations are going to emerge and present the risk that they will be resistant to the vaccine strains. So absolutely. And I can give you a personal opinion. I'm not sure if the FDA or if the WHO, as it's structured at the moment, is able to take on this politically. It's a heavy lift. I don't think this, it's so important because these pandemics are going to occur as we move forward, regardless of what, as Dr. Fauci has said, we've had 3 pandemics from a coronavirus in less than 20 years. And if we don't develop an effective vaccine against all coronavirus, we're not doing our job. I mean, we know this is going to happen in the future. So we must have the ability to protect ourselves in the future. How it becomes so political as people don't want to take blame, understandably, for the source of this vaccine. And how could you, to address the question, well, people could look for clusters of pneumonia that might have occurred in China. People have looked for prescriptions for cough medication, for example, because presumably those would go up if there were clusters of disease. We would like to look at the family members of people who worked in the Wuhan laboratory and see, do they have antibodies to this? Did they begin to spread the virus before it became so widely known? So these are very difficult issues, particularly in a closed society. And it's much easier to do that in the United States. And as you know, we are seeing evidence that this virus was circulating before December in the United States by going back and looking at blood specimens among blood donors. So it's a very complex issue, but one that is so important that we sort out. It's an international global problem.
Thanks so much. I think this is really the perfect note on which to transition, and you've laid out a bunch of themes that I'm sure we'll come back to, including the suitability and role of the World Health Organization, the challenges for international cooperation in detecting infectious diseases, but also developing vaccines and making sure that all countries can get access to them, which I know you were coming to in your last slide before I had to cut you off. So thank you again so much for joining us, for sharing your expertise with us. I think it's also really valuable to hear your individual expert perspective on all of the ways in which we can improve detection. We know that this is a political challenge, it's a scientific challenge, and it's a tricky one because it really sits at the intersection of politics and science. So without further ado, let me thank you, Dr. Cody Meisner, and give the floor to our next speaker, who is Elizabeth Goldberg, who is the former director of Smart Regulation at the European Commission. She is an alumna of the Graduate Institute. She received her master's in international economics. And as I was alluding to earlier on this panel, we have a physician, we have an economist, we have 2 lawyers, and myself, a political scientist. And I think, again, this really highlights the ways in which health and the protection of health really does require multi-sectoral and multidisciplinary engagement. So without further ado, Beth, over to you to share your views on how we can improve regulatory cooperation. Thanks very much. And I see Clementine has, yes.
There we go.
Yeah.
Yes, that's fine. And could we have a full side view? Very good.
Yes, very good.
So first of all, I would like to thank Brian for organizing this event today, because I think we would have all liked to be in person in Geneva to see all the old colleagues and so on, but a virtual meeting is second best. And Brian said, well, because I've been involved in a National Academy of Sciences panel on pharmaceutical cooperation, he thought I might be able to contribute to this panel. And so I looked at it and thought to myself, well, what can I really contribute? And I thought, well, let's look at EU regulatory policy, which I hope to set up, and see how it's done in the COVID crisis. Next slide, please. So what I would like to look at is regulatory policy discipline during the crisis. And here I'm talking about the European Commission itself, and whether the discipline or the lack thereof has had any impact on regulatory cooperation in the medicines and vaccines area. And finally, just to make a few observations about whether this crisis could act as a catalyst for new thinking on regulatory policy tools, and regulatory cooperation more generally. Next slide, please. So what am I talking about with better regulation? Well, basically what regulatory policy is in a macro sense is it's providing the decision makers with the best possible evidence, analysis, expertise on which to base their decisions. And what tools do we use in that process? Well, in the European Commission, and why do I talk about the Commission? Well, partly because I work there, but in addition, it is the body in the EU that makes the proposals for legislation. It has the right of initiative. It is the only body that can propose legislation. So regulatory policy is very important. So what are the tools? Mandatory impact assessment. So to set out the options, look at the economic, social, and environmental impact. Mandatory systematic ex post policy evaluation. So there we look at existing laws and regulations and assess them for effectiveness, efficiency, relevance, coherence. A third important component is stakeholder consultation, which is also mandatory, public consultation, and feedback. And for the last 15 to 20 years, for better or for worse, there has been a focus on simplification of law and reduction of unnecessary costs and administrative burdens. Next slide, please. So this sort of theme of my presentation today is that during the crisis, I think regulatory policy and discipline has been a bit of a casualty. So if you look back over the last year at the major proposals made by the European Commission related to COVID, there has been no impact assessment, there's been no evaluation. This relates both to the financial support programs, relates to all the initiatives under the EU Health Union. It relates also to the state aids and budgetary rules that were temporarily suspended. And that, I think, in itself is an issue. Why is it important? I will get to that in a moment. But because there are no impact assessments, there was no systematic analysis of international impacts. Consultation was basically limited to experts. And as there was no analysis framework set up, there's no monitoring framework set up for future evaluation, which makes it more difficult for policymakers to say they achieved their goals because they haven't set out the objectives or the indicators that they would use to argue their case. Next slide, please. So, does it matter? Well, I think we have to be honest that in a situation of emergency, loss of life, really uncertainty, unknowns, we have to ask ourselves if the decisions would have been different than those which were taken. And I only ask a few questions here, and this is something maybe graduate students in the audience can look at in pieces as they go along. So would a fuller analysis of trade-offs between the different types of risks have improved the quality of decisions? Would the EU proposals for export controls have benefited from a deeper analysis of international supply chains? Would the proposal to enhance the European Centre for Disease Control, the European agency similar to CDC in the States, would that have benefited from proper fact-finding mission or ex-post evaluation? Because there were obvious problems when the pandemic broke out as to why the agency was a bit slow to respond. This week, yesterday, as a matter of fact, I received my digital certificate saying that I had 2 vaccines in Belgium, which is a good thing. But the whole digital green certificate proposal was rushed through, and I think there will be questions raised about the collection, processing, and retention of digital health data. And finally, just the final question I would ask here is, I think many expectations have been raised about an EU health union. And in raising expectations, maybe there's been a bit of a lack of communication about the legal or structural limitations within the EU to a real health union. Next slide, please. In my presentation here, I'll focus on 2 things, why I think it really matters. First of all, I think there's a transparency gap. Perhaps the decision makers looked at all these issues that I was talking about, but it's not clear whether who was consulted or whether they looked at international impacts of the measures. And I think the OECD and others have pointed out many times in the past that inadequate consideration of international impacts can result in ineffective policy intervention, can result in delays, shortages, access to essential goods, and can contribute to administrative efficiency loss. So the question is, were international impacts regarded? And then also very important was, did the European Commission look at regulatory cooperation or enhanced regulatory cooperation as a tool to meet the pandemic challenge? And that's where I'll switch over to talk about regulatory cooperation. Next slide, please. What is it? Well, this is a WHO slide, actually, but it is a tool. It helps authorities manage cross-border risks, obviously, and you can generate greater efficiencies and more effective regulatory responses, obviously, when you cooperate. Our previous speaker talked about the costs of vaccine development and the approvals process. And I think in this sense, it's very important to take note that regulatory cooperation can work to reduce those costs. So what is it? You have at a very basic level an exchange of information. At a second level, you have reliance. So that's where a regulatory authority in one jurisdiction may take into account the work done by another regulatory authority in coming to a decision. And then you have mutual recognition, and that's what you have, for example, between the EU and the US on good manufacturing practice in pharmaceuticals. And there the EU will accept the American decision about a plant, and the Americans will accept the EU decision about a plant without any further inspections or controls. Next slide, please. So why is regulatory cooperation so vital in a pandemic? I think we all know that the biggest challenge for governments is to facilitate rapid access to vaccines, drugs, medical devices, PPE. We forget that during the first stages of the crisis, there was really a problem with PPE, but not only to ensure access, but to ensure the safety and quality of these products. Most countries, I think the WHO has, in its global benchmarking, said that only 100 of 195 countries have a properly functioning health regulatory authority. So most countries have very limited resources for timely review and approval. They don't have the capabilities for regulatory review, and if they have expertise, it's in specific areas. So they need to rely on the safety decisions of the WHO and well-resourced regulators such as the EU and USA. And I have to say that even the most well-resourced regulators, such as the EU, the USA, Canada, Switzerland, etc., they may lack capabilities when it comes to new technologies and novel therapeutics, such as the RNA virus. So they too rely on the expertise of others. Next slide, please. So in looking at this, making the link between sort of a lack of regulatory policy discipline, if you like, and whether that had any effect on regulatory cooperation, well, the link is a bit tenuous. You simply don't know, because you don't know to what extent regulatory cooperation was examined as a tool You could say that the speed of development and the approval of the vaccines attest to cooperation. And if you look, there are many examples of where there has been cooperation initiated or enhanced at the exchange of information level. The EMA has an open project that I've listed here. The FDA and the EU have many working groups. Multilaterally, there's the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities. So the exchange of information is going on. But I would say that, to the best of my knowledge, reliance in terms of work sharing has been limited. And for example, in the area of mutual recognition agreements, the EU-US agreement, for example, does not cover vaccines. And to my knowledge, there's been no attempt to enhance the agreement or expand the agreement to cover vaccine production facilities. Next slide, please. And does it matter? Again, does it really matter? Well, whenever you have different regulations, it of course increases cost and complexity. And we heard about the costs, and that can lead to shortages and access issues. I have questions again. Look at diagnostic tests. I think you'll see in the G20 report that is soon to come out that even in the EU, they did not have the means, the regulation to recognize rapid diagnostic tests, and that only came 1 year into the pandemic. They will also point out, I think, in the report that the WHO has only, despite the fact there are 200, 300 commercially available rapid diagnostic tests, the WHO has only approved 2 or 3 of them. So here again, could that have been speeded up through regulatory cooperation? That's a question to be asked. Could there have been more work sharing amongst stringent regulatory authorities, the well-resourced ones? The IMF just published a report where they said that the stringent regulatory authorities should move ahead in approving non-Western vaccines. Well, that's, I mean, other than the fact that there are transparency issues in some of the approvals processes, would it not have been better to ask one of the regulatory authorities to approve one of them and then recognize that? There's many questions can be asked there. And then generally, could the mishaps, ineffective PPE, invalid diagnostic, could any of this been avoided by enhanced regulatory cooperation? Next slide. I'm almost coming to the answer. So will this be a catalyst for change? I think we recognize that the current policy framework is too inflexible, too time-consuming to be used in a time of crisis. The current tools are rather static, they're backward-looking, they use statistics from the back to focus on cost, burden reduction. There's a whole debate going on in the States about whether you should not have more emphasis on distributional aspects, equity, and so on. Those are questions that can be asked. The EU just published new orientations, more foresight, better alignment with SDS goals, but really no change. So we have to ask ourselves, did we miss an opportunity there? And recently at the G20 Health Summit, they called for more regulatory cooperation, but we all know the political ups and downs and many side effects of cooperation, and that's an open question about whether that will happen. So just to conclude, I would say that, next slide, please, that I see a couple of possible solutions. So in the short term and COVID related, I think it's essential that the COVID measures undergo some sort of ex-post evaluation. So that means that thought has to be given now to a monitoring framework. And for the future, I think some sort of simplified assessment and consultation framework needs to be found for crisis situations. I know that the ACTA-A has also been criticized for being too industry-driven, non-inclusive. So I think stakeholder consultation is vitally important. In the longer term, as I said, higher priority to issues of analysis of equity, public health, environment, and so on. And I think we can all agree that enhanced regulatory cooperation between well-resourced regulators, but as well between the well-resourced and the less resourced, are things we should call for. And the last slide is just my conclusions. Thank you, Clementine. I think that there is an urgent need to implement those types of solutions. And I think by developing new approaches and deploying the tools more effectively, we can make better use of finite resources for global public health purposes. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for this very thorough overview of a number of the regulatory challenges that we've seen coming up in COVID-19, both within Europe and worldwide. I'm just going to grab the opportunity to pose one question to you, and I wanted to also remind our audience, please do feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A box. But it really struck me that one of the trends we've seen in the last year and a half is a movement away from a very centralized regulatory approach. And what I mean by centralized, that many developing countries used to really look to WHO, rely on WHO pre-qualification, for example, to give a seal of approval. And what we saw in this pandemic was a number of countries moved very quickly, developing countries, moved quickly to grant regulatory approval before WHO had reached a decision. And WHO, in some cases, took several months, more than some of the high-income countries. And I'm wondering, do you see a movement, or do you see that it would be beneficial to move back towards a more centralized kind of system? Or is this fragmentation that we've seen, a rise of perhaps regional cooperation, smaller clubs of countries cooperating with each other, is that more the direction that you think regulatory cooperation may move in?
Well, I'm a firm believer in both the rule of law and the power of law. So I think if you look at the EU itself, and I think you should look at public health in the EU as an example of how things develop, but develop slowly. As you know, the European level has limited competence in public health. It can just deal with cross-border threats. But the strength of the EU is that it regulates by a law, which means that usually, not always, but usually whatever it regulates is implemented and enforced, and you have a certain, if you like, guarantee of regulatory quality. Now, I think I must also say that during the pandemic, for example, in the EU, Hungary went its own way in approving and using completely legal. The member states can go their own way, but I think the EU is an example of where a regional body has come together and they have seen the benefits of working together. And I think that that can work in other regional circumstances. I think that if you take Singapore, if you take Southeast Asia, there's expertise there that can be exploited perhaps much better at a regional level because of the familiarity with the legal systems, the language, and so on and so forth, that you could, in my view, support the international system by fostering regional regulatory cooperation. So I think you have to start somewhere. You have to start by having solid regulation, solid law. You have to start by commonality. You have to have trust between regulators. And I think that the regional configuration is perhaps more conducive to that.
Thank you so much. And I think we've never been as clearly reminded as over the last year how much societies rely on trusted regulatory authorities to keep us safe and healthy. So without further ado, let me turn to our next speaker, who's going to expand our scope, I would say, far beyond the health sector and take a look at how COVID has been affecting the rights and work conditions of seafarers and how this affects all of us in terms of the way it impacts on global trade and supply chains, which has come up as a theme already. So I'm really delighted to introduce Cleopatra Dubia Henry, who's also an alumna of the Graduate Institute. She's currently the president of the World Maritime University. She was at the International Labour Organization for 30 years and has spent her career advocating and working to protect the labor rights of maritime workers. So without further ado, Cleo, over to you. And I'm not sure if Clementine has. There we go. Okay. Clementine's getting your slides up.
Just have to make sure. Okay. Okay, that works?
Yes, very good.
Great.
Please.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, it's a delight for me to join such an auspicious panel, actually. And I want to thank, very, very much the ASHI for inviting us to be part of this very important symposium on global health. And global health and global health security, really. But I thought I would take an approach of looking at how the pandemic has affected seafarers around the world and therefore shipping. Forget the world depends on shipping, It is the most effective means of transport of goods to, around the world. And without it, many of us, of course, they're far from sight, and we often don't even see the ships themselves that are bringing us the goods that we all depend on. So one of the first things I wanted to highlight is the designation that was now collectively agreed by all the UN system organizations that seafarers should be classified as key workers. And so I think this has been a tremendous feat, and seeing how all the organizations came together to achieve that and to coordinate the responses to the pandemic from among all of the organizations. I think we've seen for the first time so many institutions within the United Nations system coming together. But let me then focus just really now on the global supply chain that we all depend on, and who really are the people that make it possible. 90% of global trade depends on shipping, and most of us forget that. So it's one of the first things I wanted to say. And believe it or not, only 1.5 million people are making all of this possible. There are about, every day at sea, 65,000 ships. And unfortunately, more and more, there are many ships, but more and more the crew numbers are getting smaller and smaller. Of course, the technology is having one impact, but it is certainly ways in which costs can be reduced as far as ship owners are concerned. What was important really was that designation of seafarers as key workers, and both all of the UN system, including the United Nations General Assembly in December, endorsed that designation. Seafarers, as I said, we rely on them every day, including for energy, for food, for medicine, all the various products that we take for granted. They make an invaluable contribution to our economy and our society. And of course, during this pandemic, they have faced the most extraordinary of, let's say, circumstances that none of us who are on hand and who can go home every day, that most of us did not have to face. As a result, these are...
Cleopatra, I'm sorry, yes. I'm cutting you because I don't know if you're not telling me to change slides, but I will need your guidance to know when...
Okay, so how do I know this? How do I do this?
The slides should be on your screen and I'm the one changing them. So every time you need me to go to the next slide, you just tell me.
All right, thank you so much. Okay, thanks a lot for that. Yes, so I was referring to, in fact, the very emotional and health problems that seafarers face and the financial hardships they've had. And that the fact that so many countries have had lockdowns and the impact, of course, that this has had in terms of air transport. But shipping remained really, they continue to remain the only mode in which the goods that we need every day could be received and we could continue to enjoy. The exemptions that were granted to seafarers in terms of enabling them to return home and has been a real challenge. I think this has not worked out very well. Many seafarers are still at sea for months without being able to return home. Let me turn to the second slide. So one of the major concerns has been the working conditions of seafarers. They're often at sea for more than, the ILO Maritime Labor Convention, for which I was responsible, has a threshold of a maximum of 11 months at sea. But with the pandemic, there were many excuses, and it was impossible for seafarers to return home. So many of them have remained at sea well beyond the number of months maximum required on the international legal instruments. They, of course, have not been able either to have access to medical treatment, and they're in a way the hours of work and hours of rest that they had certainly went out through the window. Next slide. One of the biggest challenges is the crew change. Many, of course, as we all know, many countries shut their borders. And therefore, these 200,000 seafarers at sea were left stranded. And of course, they could not return home to their countries and to their loved ones. If we looked at just the cruise industry alone, at one point in time, you had 70,000 crew just for the US alone in cruise ships in the US, much less than, I'm not talking about the cargo, just on the cruise ship side, some 70,000 crew members in the US could not leave their ships for a number of months. Finally, the US managed to resolve that problem, but around the world that was not resolved for many seafarers, many of whom are still at sea. What the result was a lot of mental health issues, mental health, welfare and well-being. A number of suicides have taken place at sea because seafarers were stuck. Today, we now know that vaccination is the next biggest challenge. And we will see, and we hope that we will see, I'll address it a little bit later, but we will see and hope that vaccination for seafarers, because they are at sea and they're not on land in their own home countries, that this will be another of the many challenges. The UN Secretary General, as I indicated, joined with all the other UN organizations to ensure that protocols set up by the IMO and the IMO with the support of the shipping industry, both the ship owners and the seafarer organizations and a lot of governments and other institutions that are part of the, I would say, shipping industry broadly, they made a huge effort and impact in ensuring that protocols were developed and enabled the shipping industry to follow these protocols. That, I think, was one of the most tremendous, I would say, impact that I have seen in how the industry have come together to actually develop themselves these protocols, and then to make and to enable all countries to use these protocols, including to enable seafarers to disembark or to join ships. Next slide. Seafaring is I would say, an international industry, and seafarers are multinational, come from different countries, and therefore we have a multinational crew. And of course, part of the challenge of a multinational crew, languages are different, eating habits are different. There are so many things that make things very, very difficult. But one of the things that I wanted to identify in this particular slide was that the seafarers were finally, a number of seafarers, although still many are at sea, were able to, with this 12-point step plan, to restart crew changes so that those who were at sea could disembark and fresh crew could then join the ships from which the others would disembark in. Essential supplies such as medical care, fuel, water, spare parts, all of these were challenges when ships arrived in port. Next slide. One of the important instruments, and I want to refer to it because it's close to my heart, is the Maritime Labor Convention. And this is the instrument that governs the world of work as far as shipping is concerned. This is the Maritime Labor Convention, which was adopted by the ILO in 2006, and which is today ratified by 98 countries, representing 91% of the global fleet of ships. So quite a high number of ships, even if the 98 countries, but what is important here is that there has been a wide ratification of the convention by countries that are maritime in terms of either in terms of seafarers or in terms of where the ships are registered or are owned. But one of the important issues was the welfare and well-being of the seafarers during these very difficult times. They suffered from psychosocial issues, from stress. There were suicides that have taken place. And of course, getting them the necessary provisions that they needed and the supplies and medical care were among the many challenges that they have faced and many still continue to face. Next slide, please. Governments and national authorities were requested to do a number of things. They were to ensure that the MLC, despite the pandemic, was complied with, and that provisions were in place for the health protection, medical care, and welfare. These are all provided for in the MLC Convention. One other challenge was the ability of seafarers when their ships reached a particular port in a particular country, enabling the seafarers to disembark to get a drink, to disembark to get medical care. Huge challenges were faced. Seafarers could not disembark from their ships because countries were all concerned about the spread of COVID-19 in their countries. It took a long time, and there's still many seafarers who've not been able, more than 20,000 seafarers are still not able to be repatriated more than 11 months into their contracts. This, therefore, continues to remain a huge challenge. Transfer and transit in countries, even if they were able to disembark in ports, in actual countries themselves, many countries did not allow and still continue not to allow seafarers to transit and transfer. Very important thing to note is that seafarers today are coming from the developing world. The world is crewed by seafarers from developing countries. They are owned elsewhere, but they're crewed by the developing world, seafarers. And so for them, they have to transit, transfer, sometimes from many different destinations before they can actually eventually reach home. One thing is to disembark in a port. The second thing is to be able to take a flight to one port to another country. And often for many of them, because they come from the developing world, the transit points are so many for them to pass that many of them have not been able to actually return home as they would otherwise have been able to do under normal circumstances. But certainly we were not in normal times, but even not being in normal times, and despite the fact that the instruments concerned were ratified, largely ratified by the countries that in fact are responsible for crewing ships, when they arrived in ports, many countries did not allow and still do not allow them to disembark. So this is one of the biggest of the challenges. Another important element that I want to highlight here is the fact that this is the only category of workers that we know that exist that have an international identity document. And this is another ILO instrument that provides for seafarers to have a standard identity document allowing them to transit, transfer across countries around the world. Often, of course, the challenge has been whether or not all of these countries have ratified the convention. And if they have ratified, they should enable them to transit and transfer. But also because during COVID-19, many countries, even if they had the seafarer identity document, which is mandatory to have on board ships, many countries would not have allowed it for fear of the spread that seafarers would also be spreaders of COVID-19. So these have been huge issues. As a result, suicides have been not often publicized, but quite a number of seafarers have taken their lives. Next slide, please. So how have these crew changes been taking place during this pandemic? There have been a number of guidelines that have been identified for enabling the seafarers to be able to transit and transfer. And of course, importantly, to being in line with the Maritime Labour Convention, which has set which sets a maximum time at sea as 11 months, no more than 11 months. But of course, with COVID-19, that became a huge challenge. Next slide, just to continue to follow. Vaccination is one of the important issues. And this is where the current, while we still have many seafarers at sea who cannot transit and transfer to their home countries, the big issue now is how will they and can they get access to vaccinations? Many of them are far from, most of them, if not all, are far from home, far from sight, because they're on board ships. And how is vaccination going to be made possible? The shipping industry, and that is very good, at least I've noted that there was one really tremendous partnership with the industry, ship owners and seafarer organizations, as well as a number of other organizations that support and work within the maritime industry. They themselves came together and developed their own protocols. And among those protocols that they have identified is one that relates now to vaccination. But vaccination is a national thing. Countries, and so there has not yet been a modality to enable seafarers, irrespective of the country from which they come, to receive the vaccinations in that wherever their ships disembark or arrive and discharging goods. There are few countries that have begun, but very few indeed. So therefore, it is very important that a roadmap for vaccination of seafarers be considered if we want to continue to ensure that the global supply chain continues to feed the world. Not just feed it, but all the goods that we all need to make our daily lives as comfortable as possible. That designation of key workers, I think, I would hope, is also an important push for vaccination of seafarers in ports in which their ships arrive. Because many of the seafarers will never be able to transit and transfer through the many hoops of airports before they can actually reach home. So vaccination in ports when the ships arrive, in my view, is the most effective means of ensuring that we can manage and control the virus, and at the same time ensure that the global supply chain remains open and that ships can continue to bring the goods and other forms of equipment that we need. Next slide, please.
May I ask you to wrap up, please?
I think we're coming to the end.
Okay, thank you.
So here, really, it is just given information relating to the fact that I have to, of course, that cannot pass on noticed, as that it is a male-dominated industry, and there are only 2% of the female workforce in that industry. The most imbalanced, that I would say there are two industries that are imbalanced in the world today, and they remain the maritime industry and the mining industry, 2 M's. So what I think, however, is an important issue for going forward is mental health. Mental health, whether it's for us right now, we all need it. Can you imagine the mental health of seafarers? So this human element at sea is extremely important, and we all hope that the action is taken by all countries, wherever their ships land, that they can help deal with the issue of seafarers' mental health. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Dubia Henry. This was an issue that certainly I knew far too little about, and I've learned a great deal from your presentation. I'm going to ask, I have a burning question, but I'm going to reserve it for the written Q&A and perhaps ask you to respond in writing in the interest of time. I think this is an excellent Jumping off point, however, for our next and last speaker, who is Amélie Rioux. She's the technical officer at the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, also an alumna of the Graduate Institute, one of our more recent alumna. She earned her LLM in the joint Georgetown Graduate Institute program. She has been with the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board from the beginning. And for those of you who are not familiar with the GPMB, it's a relatively new institution that was created at the global level to try to, in fact, take into account this very, very broad range of issues that we've seen all of the previous speakers touching on, to look far beyond the health sector to strengthen global preparedness and response to pandemics. So Amélie, without further ado, over to you. And I think we may have to take questions in written format for all of our speakers. So please do keep an eye on the Q&A and the chat.
Great, thank you, Suri. I'm very happy to join you today for this very warm day in Geneva. Many thanks to the Graduate Institute for the invitation. So I was asked to speak on global governance challenges impeding adequate response to outbreaks. Obviously, this is extremely timely and relevant, and not just because we're in the middle of the biggest pandemic in 100 years, but also because right now we're in the middle of very important discussions that have the potential to reboot governance for global health. But whether these changes will take place is unclear right now. There are a lot of uncertainty as to whether global leaders will be able to agree on what is the right way forward, and if there will be sufficient political will to actually make these changes. So for my presentation today, I will take you through the current context of global governance, outline some of the key challenges, and discuss some of the solutions which I personally, in my view, think could address those challenges. So before I move forward, as Suri said, I work for the Global Preparedness Monitoring Framework, Global Preparedness Monitoring Board. I'm speaking in my personal capacity here. So the elements that I've outlined in my presentation are not necessarily the views of the board. So next slide, please. So global governance is the process and structures which bring together diverse actors to coordinate and agree on collective action. So obviously, over the last few years, the context in which global governance operates has become quite challenging. And I don't think this is news to anyone. On the one hand, we're seeing an increasingly complex environment and many new challenges. And on the other, we're seeing trends that are polarizing the world and making collaboration harder. These include challenges related to state sovereignty, growing nationalism, a crisis of multilateralism, a growing lack of trust, and years of underinvestment in public institutions. Next slide. So over the last 20 to 30 years, the world has changed really rapidly. It's become more interconnected, and we're facing many new challenges, as I said. So there's climate change, biodiversity loss, migration, population growth, and a changing global political landscape. And these challenges are driving increasingly complex crises, leading to multifaceted shocks. And what I mean here, and I think that was addressed by many of the speakers, is that one event like an outbreak or a pandemic has impacts way beyond health dimensions, including major socioeconomic and geopolitical consequences. So of course, COVID-19 is unprecedented, so not all outbreaks are on that scale, but we can see that its impact has been felt across every part of society. So during the pandemic, close to 2 billion children were taken out of school, and it's had major impacts on productivity, leading to potential losses of 22 trillion to the global economy. Hundreds of millions of people are being driven into poverty, and we've lost progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. But we've seen similar issues, of course, on a much smaller scale, arising during Ebola in West Africa, for example. And our responses to these multifaceted crises has also become more complex. So we have many new organizations, many sectors, and many layers are involved, but we don't necessarily have the coordination in place. Next slide. So at the same time, we're seeing growing nationalism across countries and what many have called a crisis of multilateralism. So many leaders are focusing inwards, and they're preferring to deal with issues unilaterally or bilaterally. So here you can see a map of countries in red that have adopted temporary export measures during COVID-19. So these measures have blocked the export of masks, gloves, pharmaceutical products, hand sanitizer, food, etc. And that has left many countries on their own without essential medical products to fight the pandemic. We're also seeing a growing rejection of international cooperation and a mistrust of international organizations by certain leaders. Of course, the greatest example being the US announcing it would leave WHO last year. Thankfully, of course, they changed their mind, but this mistrust is impacting international organizations' capacity to fulfill their mandate. So what we're seeing now is leaders across the world seem less able to cooperate, even as complex global challenges are on the rise. Next slide. And this is associated more generally to trust declining within and among nations. So we see that people are losing faith in political leaders, public institutions, and each other. And this is driven by increasing inequalities, increasing polarization, and of course, a pandemic of misinformation that we see on social media. But I think it's also linked to a lack of accountability by leaders. There are many promises that are made, many not fulfilled, and many commitments that are not met. Many vulnerable groups are feeling left behind, excluded from decision-making and political processes. And all of this is breeding mistrust. And what you see here is the Edelman Trust Barometer for 2021. And we can see that COVID-19 has had a bigger impact on more vulnerable groups. That's driving further inequalities. And of course, that also is driving further mistrust. Next slide. So for many countries, COVID-19 was amplified by years of chronic underinvestment in public institutions, whether it's healthcare system, education, social protection system, and this has made many systems fragile and outdated. And it's left them incapable of having a mounting a rapid surge response like was necessary in the beginning, or responding with agility to ensure that other health outcomes didn't suffer. So for instance, like on this slide, maternal care. So of course, this has also left our international institutions weaker and prevented us from funding what we call the global goods that we needed to prevent pandemics, like powerful detection systems or strong supply chain networks. Next slide, please. So how does this affect global governance? Well, we're seeing some, actually many leadership failures and an international system that's struggling to act. There are issues around equity and access to medical countermeasures, difficulty with multi-sectoral action, and a lack of compliance and accountability. Next slide. So because of transnational political tensions, multilateral bodies have struggled to respond during COVID and to take collective action. So for example, it took several months for the Security Council to agree on a resolution on COVID-19, and many have criticized the G7 and the G20 for acting too slowly and not taking measures on the scale needed to contain and mitigate the pandemic. I think things are slowly moving in a better direction. For example, we have the World Health Assembly that adopted 2 resolutions on strengthening preparedness, including one on a proposed pandemic framework convention. And we see many new proposals arising from G20, G7, and gaining momentum around financing for preparedness and governance. Another important challenge is that WHO is underfunded and undercapacitated. So WHO has for mandate the attainment by all people of the highest possible level of health. This is an extremely ambitious and broad mandate, but its budget is very small comparatively, and the big majority of it is earmarked. So member states have refused for many years to increase its core budget, what we call the assessed contributions, to make this a more sustainable budget. And this, of course, is affecting WHO's ability to lead health emergency preparedness and response and to provide necessary support for countries. But although I have to say they have done a tremendous job, I think, with the capacity they have. So next slide, please. So I'm sure many of you have heard the appeals for global solidarity around COVID-19 vaccines. So the issue of equity is a big challenge to health emergency response. We've seen repeatedly during the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, the Ebola outbreaks, and now with COVID-19. And while, of course, this is a moral issue, it also relates to what many refer to our shared vulnerability and the notion that no one is safe until all are safe. And the problem of inequity, of course, comes from the fact that medical goods, resources, and countermeasures are scarce during a health emergency. We don't have the capacity to produce enough. So their access is subject to competition between countries, national self-interest, and become limited by the ability to pay. So for example, for vaccines, many countries establish with manufacturers what we call advance purchase agreements, which gives them the right to access vaccines first to protect their own population. So poorer countries get relegated to the bottom of the list because they can't afford to compete. And so in that situation, for them, access becomes dependent on global charity or geopolitical interests rather than public health needs. And this is problematic because to stop an outbreak, you need to be strategic. You need to protect those that are most likely to suffer the worst outcomes and to break the chain of transmission. So national self-interest is not the best strategy. Next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, our response to health emergencies has become very complex, and that's because we need to address health, socioeconomic, environmental, and political dimension. And that requires implementing both health-specific preparedness elements like laboratories, data sharing platform, vaccine manufacturing plants, but also to have broader whole of society resilience. And to do this, we need to work across sectors. So from finance, economic sectors, education, food production, labor, security, digital technology, etc. But because of this complexity, we also need to be more flexible and agile. And unfortunately, our governance structures are fragmented, and the institutions that we have are working often in silos. And it's very difficult for institutions, whether at the global or even national level, to work across sector. And this is really a major challenge when we need to respond to a pandemic. Next slide. So another important challenge is the low compliance with international commitments. So very few countries have adequately implemented the international health regulations. So most countries don't have in place the basic systems to prevent and respond to outbreaks, despite the fact that they have made commitments for this. So while we have some mechanisms like the GPMB or the joint external evaluations to highlight that lack of compliance and incentivize greater preparedness, there's no mechanism that can actually ensure compliance. In addition, there's very little transparency in decision-making processes around preparedness and response, and communities and vulnerable groups are not sufficiently included. And this makes it very difficult to hold leaders accountable and to ensure they make decisions in the best interest of all communities. And so here at the bottom, I have included a quote from our co-chair from the GPMB. And I just wanted to highlight that without transparency and accountability, there's no trust, and without trust, it's almost impossible to fight the pandemic. Next slide. So I'm almost done. So how can we address these challenges? So here I've listed 5 governance solutions, which I think would help make the world better prepared and able to prevent and mitigate health emergencies. These don't necessarily come from my head. They're being discussed currently in different forums. But first, I think we need to elevate commitment to health emergency preparedness to the highest level to ensure accountability and a multi-sectoral response. So for example, some of you may have heard of the Independent Panel on Pandemic Preparedness Response, which was tasked with assessing the global COVID-19 response. The panel has recommended the establishment of a Global Health Threats Council composed of heads of states. The GPMB has called for governments to elevate the management of health emergency at the highest level of government. Secondly, I think we need to adopt legally binding commitments around access to countermeasures, compliance, and financing. I think certain obligations, especially those where we need global cooperation and where there are disincentives to cooperate, like access to vaccines, or where leaders have failed for many years to take action, like financing, those require legally binding commitments. And there are currently ongoing discussions within WHO on the adoption of a pandemic framework convention, which could potentially include these dimensions. Third, I think we need to build a framework or mechanism to facilitate multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder action and coordination across the UN system, but also beyond to other sectors. The GPMB has called for a UN summit leading to the adoption of a UN-wide framework for preparedness. The independent panel has made a similar call for a political declaration by UN member states. And this would bring more coherence to the broader health emergency ecosystem. Or I think we need to create new ways to better engage and include communities, including women, youth, vulnerable groups, and civil society in decision-making and planning. There's really a disconnect between the way we plan preparedness from the top down and the bottom-up nature of a pandemic response. And we need better ways to involve regular citizens, communities, and vulnerable groups into preparedness. And finally, I think we need to strengthen oversight and accountability mechanisms. We need to empower these mechanisms and develop better approaches to hold leaders accountable. For example, there are discussions within WHO on implementing a universal periodic review process for preparedness, which is similar to what we have in the human rights system. And final slide, please. So where does this leave us? So as I mentioned, there are many important discussions taking place right now and over the next few months. We recently had the G7 summit. So first, we need to address the challenges that are preventing us from ending this pandemic, especially around medical countermeasures, access to vaccines. But then we need to make reforms for the future. And I think the outcomes of the discussions that are ongoing will depend on whether countries can coalesce around certain proposals like the Pandemic Framework Convention. But in a highly polarized world like we have right now, it's likely that we may end up with some subgroups endorsing certain proposal. And I think it's unlikely we'll quickly have a broad consensus approach over one position. So while this is positive in a way that if we can see progress and change, I think this might bring some further challenges when we're trying to fight the pathogens that know no borders. So, and just one final note, I think it's very important that we make the necessary changes now, because there's always what we call in the GPMB this cycle of panic and neglect, and it's likely that if we don't take the momentum right now to make these changes, we won't be able to do it, and then we won't stop the next pandemic. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily, for providing us with a very expansive, ambitious, and I would call it 10,000 foot view. And I think we really began with this panel at the microbial level. So it's quite appropriate that we've spanned from the microbe to the globe, as the Institute likes to do. I want to thank all of our speakers. Unfortunately, we've gone over time, so we don't have time for discussion, but I think all of our speakers have learned a tremendous amount from you, and you really do the Institute proud as our alums. And I think this is probably an appropriate note on which I ought to give the floor to the Vice President of our Alumni Association, Jason Shalaby, who's the Director of Global Health Policy at the Novartis Foundation, to wrap up. Jason, over to you.
Thank you very much, Siri. And on behalf of the Alumni Committee and Alumni Association, I also want to thank you all for joining this first Geneva Roundtable Symposium. And we cannot leave this without saying a very special thank you to Professor Brian Bethune for initiating the symposium concept and his leadership this past year in putting this all together with Karine Le, Paul Mathieu, Clémentine Pierrefeu, and the Alumni Office. And we are also very grateful for the support of Director Sal of the Graduate Institute, the faculty moderators, and all the panelists for their presentations, and really exciting discussions we've seen over the past 2 days that were reviewed by over 150 participants. Now, From the Alumni Committee's perspective, this shift to virtual has really provided great momentum to connect our global community of alumni, students, and faculty, and the symposium further reflects this growing appetite for sharing ideas and concepts that the faculty has developed during the academic year of the alumni. And we also believe this symposium format has a great potential, and we hope to reconvene again next year in person in order to create more links for exchange and thought leadership across the Graduate Institute's community. We would also, of course, welcome your active participation in leading and creating and shaping this next annual symposium events as we gear up actually to the 100th anniversary of the Institute in 2027. And we are also open to suggestions on how this can be done in other regions in years to come, as we see this can be done throughout the calendar year. So as we reach a close, I also take this opportunity to flag that the alumni reunion will be taking place on September 25th at the new residence of the Graduate Institute, in which we hope that we'll more for in-person connection and that many of you will be able to join us as well. So with that, I thank you very much again for your participation and to all the speakers, and wish you all a great rest of your day. Thank you very much. Everyone.
Thank you. Well done.